Sandra opened up. Keanu's silent gaze shocked everyone. The room was quiet in a way that felt almost heavy. People sat together, but no one spoke, waiting for something they didn't even know they were waiting for. Then Sandra slowly lifted her head, her eyes trembling with unshed tears. Her voice was soft, almost broken when she began to speak. "I never wanted to tell this story," she whispered, "but keeping it inside has been hurting me more than the truth ever could." Instantly, every ear turned toward her. Even the people who had been distracted a moment before were now caught in her words. There was a strange power in her tone, a mixture of fear and courage, as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to leap. Keanu sat across from her, silent as always. He didn't try to interrupt, didn't even shift in his chair. His eyes, however, were fixed on her with a stillness that carried more weight than words. It was not judgment, it was not pity. It was something deeper, something that made Sandra's breath hitch in her chest. The others glanced at him, almost unconsciously, because there was something about his presence that anchored the room. Sandra saw his gaze and felt both exposed and strangely safe, as if he was holding her pain without speaking a single word. She went on. "There were nights I sat alone, wondering if anyone would notice if I just disappeared. I tried to smile in front of people, but inside I was drowning. I didn't want to burden anyone, so I stayed quiet. But silence can become a cage, and I locked myself inside it." The tension grew thicker. Someone shifted uncomfortably, another bit their lip, but Keanu didn't move. He just listened, really listened. And that listening shook Sandra more than any words of comfort could. Her voice broke when she said, "I remember sitting on a park bench once, holding a notebook I could barely write in because my hands were shaking. And I thought, maybe this is all I'll ever be. Someone who carries her stories, but never tells them." Keanu leaned forward slightly, not much, but enough that Sandra noticed. His eyes glistened faintly, though no tear fell. It was not a dramatic gesture, not something loud or showy, but it was enough to let her know he was with her. And in that quiet, Sandra felt the strength to keep going. The room was pulled into her story like a tide. People forgot the time, forgot their own distractions, because the rawness of her truth touched something deep in everyone. When she finally tried to open up before, she said, "People told me to move on, to be stronger, to smile more." They didn't understand that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can feel like a hand pulling you back from the edge. But no one gave me that hand. So I taught myself to keep walking, even when every step felt heavy. Her words carried a rhythm of pain and survival. And through it all, Keanu's silent gaze never wavered. His stillness was not empty. It was filled with presence, filled with respect, filled with the kind of humility that doesn't seek to fix or control, but simply to honor someone else's truth. The silence after her words was almost unbearable. People didn't know how to respond. But Keanu's gaze softened in a way that spoke louder than any reply. Sandra saw it, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel ashamed of her tears. She let them fall. And that was the moment the air in the room shifted. What no one realized yet was that this was not the end of Sandra's story. It was only the beginning, and Keanu's silent gaze was about to change everything.
The silence that followed Sandra's confession seemed to stretch endlessly, like a fragile thread no one dared to cut. The others looked at her with mixed emotions, some with pity, some with confusion, and a few with genuine concern. But none of their reactions carried the same weight as Keanu's stillness. His gaze was steady, quiet, but it carried a depth that no words could reach. Sandra lowered her eyes for a moment, feeling as though the tears she had finally let slip were betraying her strength. But instead of shame, she felt something unusual, relief. It was as if her chest had been holding a heavy stone for years, and now, speaking it aloud, even trembling, had loosened its grip. Still, she feared judgment. She feared someone would sigh, dismiss her, or whisper about how weak she must be. Then she dared to glance up, and her eyes locked with Keanu's. He had not shifted, he had not looked away. He did not frown or smile. Instead, his gaze carried a softness, like a quiet flame in the darkness. It was the kind of look that told her, without a single word, "I see you, I hear you, I am here." The others could feel it too. They didn't need him to speak. His silence was enough to shape the entire atmosphere. Sandra's voice trembled again as she continued. "I used to write letters to myself, trying to believe I had worth. I told myself that maybe one day someone would read my words and understand. But every time I tried to show them, people laughed or brushed them aside. So I kept them hidden, filling notebooks that no one ever saw. I thought my pain didn't matter. I thought I didn't matter." Her hands clenched together, her nails pressing against her palms. She was bracing herself for rejection, for indifference. But Keanu's silent gaze never wavered. His body language was calm, his shoulders relaxed, yet his eyes carried an intensity that seemed to reach into her soul. It was then that a surprising thing happened. Sandra felt a shift inside her. She realized she was no longer speaking into emptiness. She was not talking to a crowd that would forget her words tomorrow. She was talking to someone who was present in the truest sense of the word. And so she dug deeper. "There was a night," she said softly, "when I almost didn't make it through. I sat alone in my room, staring at the walls, wondering if the world would be better off without me. I told myself no one would notice. I told myself my story would die with me, and maybe that was the way it was meant to be. But then I heard music outside my window, a man playing guitar on the street. The song was simple, almost clumsy, but it carried warmth. That sound reminded me that there was still beauty even in broken places, and I clung to that moment as if it was life itself." Her words drew the room into a deeper silence. Some listeners wiped their eyes. Others looked down, suddenly remembering their own nights of quiet despair. Keanu finally moved, just slightly, but enough to be noticed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows gently on his knees, his gaze still fixed on her. He did not interrupt. He did not try to fill the silence with comfort. Instead, his body language told her, "I am leaning closer because your story matters." The subtle gesture unlocked something inside her chest. "I realized that night," she said, her voice growing steadier, "that sometimes we survive because of the smallest things, a song, a smile, a stranger who looks at you like you exist. We don't always need someone to fix us. Sometimes we just need someone to stay, someone who doesn't look away." Her eyes shimmered as they met his again, and this time she saw something that almost startled her. Behind Keanu's calm gaze was a flicker of pain, a quiet sorrow he carried but never spoke about. It was as if he knew too well the kind of loneliness she described. And in that shared recognition, something powerful passed between them, something unspoken, yet undeniable. The others in the room felt it too. They didn't need him to speak. His silence was enough to shape the entire atmosphere. Sandra's voice trembled again as she continued. "I was afraid to open up today. But when I saw the way you looked at me, gave me courage. Because you weren't looking through me, you weren't distracted, you weren't impatient. You were simply here. And sometimes that is all we need. Someone who chooses to stay." Keanu's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, he simply nodded, the slowest, most respectful nod, one that carried both acknowledgement and quiet honor. The room felt different now. The tension had shifted into something softer, something more human. Everyone realized that they were witnessing something rare. It was not just Sandra's vulnerability. It was the way Keanu's silent presence turned that vulnerability into strength instead of weakness. And though he still had not spoken a single word, everyone could feel it. His gaze carried a truth that no speech could ever match. What they didn't know was that his silence was not just respect. It was also a reflection of battles he himself had fought, battles he had chosen not to reveal. But soon, those unspoken parts of his story would come to light, and they would shake everyone in ways they could never expect.
The room had become something different now, almost like a sanctuary. No one shifted in their seats, no one looked away, no one even dared to check the time. All of them were locked inside the silence that had been built between Sandra and Keanu. It was not an empty silence. It was alive, heavy, and full of things no one had yet spoken aloud. Sandra sat with her breath uneven, her eyes still wet, but there was a change in her posture. She was not hunched anymore. She was not curling into herself. Slowly, her back had straightened, as though each word she had spoken had given her just enough strength to lift her head higher. She looked fragile and strong all at once, a contradiction that felt painfully human. Keanu, on the other hand, remained still. But inside that stillness was a storm no one could see. He had spent years perfecting the art of silence, years keeping his own wounds buried beneath layers of quiet humility. He had never sought to put his pain on display, never wanted eyes on him for reasons beyond his work. But Sandra's words had been like a key, turning in a lock he hadn't realized was waiting. The others felt it too. They were no longer just spectators of Sandra's confession. They were witnesses to something larger, something forming in the space between her broken words and his silent gaze. It was like watching two currents of water collide, not with violence, but with inevitability. Sandra's voice returned, fragile but clear. "I used to walk past people every day, thinking none of them could possibly understand. I thought the world was too busy, too distracted, too uncaring. But maybe I wasn't looking closely enough. Maybe there are people who see, even when they say nothing." Her eyes lingered on Keanu as she said it, and everyone in the room noticed. It was as if she had drawn a line directly between herself and him, and no one else could cross it. A murmur of thought stirred in the group. They began to wonder, though silently, about their own lives. How many people had they passed by without really seeing? How many quiet struggles had been invisible because they had never stopped long enough to look into someone's eyes? Keanu shifted then, a movement so subtle, yet so full of weight that the room almost held its breath. He leaned back, his hands unclasping, his shoulders loosening, as though he was allowing himself to breathe differently for the first time in a long while. He had not spoken, not even once, but in his silence he had given Sandra the space to transform her pain into something powerful. Sandra noticed it, that subtle shift, and for reasons she couldn't explain, it gave her courage to reach deeper into her story. She said, "There were days," she said slowly, "when I felt like I was walking through the world invisible. I smiled at people and they walked past. I spoke and no one really listened. I thought maybe my life would be nothing more than that, moving through the world unseen. But now I see something different. I see that even silence can mean presence, that maybe someone, somewhere, is holding space for you, even if you never realize it. Her words hung in the air like a soft echo, and Keanu's eyes softened further. His lips pressed together, not in resistance, but as if he was holding back a truth he wasn't ready to let go of yet. Then something happened that none of them expected. Sandra leaned forward, her voice breaking slightly as she asked, "Keanu, what are you holding inside?" The question was not harsh. It was not demanding. It was tender, fragile, but it cut deeper than anything said before. Everyone's eyes darted to him. The air tightened instantly. Here was a man known for his quiet, his humility, his distance. And now the question was placed in his hands like a fragile piece of glass. Keanu lowered his eyes for a long moment. His silence stretched out and the tension rose with every heartbeat. The others shifted, unsure whether he would respond at all. Finally, he exhaled slowly, and though no words escaped his lips, the weight of that breath told its own story. Sandra understood. She saw it in the way his shoulders seemed to carry more than just the weight of his own body. And for the first time, she didn't feel alone. Because his silence was not emptiness, it was connection. It was his way of saying, "Yes, I know what it feels like. Yes, I have carried it too." The others in the room were moved beyond words. They saw it too. They saw the way two broken pieces of humanity were finding one another in the unlikeliest of ways, through quiet, through honesty, through pain. Sandra let out a trembling breath. She said, "Maybe we're not as alone as we think. Maybe all it takes is one person willing to stay." Keanu lifted his eyes again, and this time, though still silent, his gaze carried something new, an unspoken promise. What no one could know in that moment was that his silence was about to break, and when it did, the story would turn in a way none of them were prepared for. The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. "You never were." They seemed to echo inside the hearts of everyone in the room, as if those three quiet words had been meant not just for Sandra, but for each of them. No one dared to move. No one dared to break the fragile atmosphere that had formed. Sandra sat frozen, her tears falling freely now, not out of despair, but out of release. For so long she had carried her pain like a secret weight, convinced that no one could understand, that no one would choose to stay if they truly knew her. But Keanu's words had cracked through that belief, showing her that even the deepest loneliness can be touched by connection. Keanu leaned back slightly, his shoulders rising and falling with a slow breath. His eyes were calm, but behind them was a storm of memories. Everyone could feel it, the sense that he had not just listened, but that he had lived something that made her pain familiar to him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to speak more. "There were days," he began softly, "when I carried grief so heavy, it felt like it would bury me alive. People looked at me and saw calm, but inside I was breaking. I lost people I loved, people who meant the world to me. And when they were gone, I learned how cruel silence could be. The world moved on, but my heart stayed stuck in that empty space." The room grew colder with his words. No one breathed too loudly, afraid to interrupt. But I also learned something else. Pain doesn't always need to be hidden. It can be carried with dignity. And sometimes, when you meet someone else who has suffered, you don't need to explain everything. You just know. You feel it in their eyes. You recognize the silence that mirrors your own. Sandra's eyes widened. She had seen that silence in him, felt it pressing against her when their gazes locked. And now, hearing him speak of it, she realized she had not been imagining it. "So when you spoke tonight," Keanu said, turning his gaze directly to her, "I wasn't just hearing your story, I was remembering my own. And I couldn't look away, because I knew how much it cost you to open that door. I know because I've stood at that same door myself." Sandra covered her mouth with her trembling hand. The others stared at Keanu in stunned silence, seeing him not as an untouchable figure, but a man who had lived through heartbreak, a man who had carried scars invisible to the world. He let his words rest in the air for a long moment before speaking again. The truth is, we all carry something. We all have nights we don't talk about, losses we bury, fears we hide. But maybe the point isn't to bury them deeper. Maybe the point is to share them so someone else doesn't feel like they're the only one. His voice cracked slightly at the end, and though he caught himself quickly, the vulnerability was undeniable. And that single crack was more powerful than any polished speech could ever be. Sandra wiped her tears, her voice fragile but steady. When you say that, it feels like you're lifting some of the weight off me. Like you're showing me I don't have to carry it alone anymore. Keanu gave a faint nod, his eyes softening. Because you don't. None of us do. The others looked at one another. Some had tears glistening in their eyes. Others looked down, overwhelmed by their own memories of silence, of grief, of being unseen. The atmosphere had shifted again. It was no longer just about Sandra's pain or Keanu's silence. It was about all of them, every single person in that room, realizing they were part of something larger, something deeply human. Then Keanu leaned forward, his voice low but firm. There's a reason we are here together tonight. Maybe it's not chance. Maybe it's because some stories are not meant to be carried alone. Maybe this moment is proof that even when you think the world doesn't see you, someone does. And that can change everything. Sandra closed her eyes and let the words sink into her soul. When she opened them again, she found herself staring at him not as a distant figure, but as someone who had walked through the same darkness and chosen to stay. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that healing was possible. And though no one in the room spoke for a long time after that, they all felt it. The shift, the quiet awakening. Keanu's silent gaze and Sandra's trembling truth had brought them to a place none of them had expected. A place where pain was not weakness, but connection. Where silence was not absence, but presence. But what none of them could predict was that the most powerful moment was still to come. Keanu had opened the door to his pain, but the story he had yet to tell would shock everyone in ways they were not ready for.
The silence in the room stretched on, no longer heavy with fear, but heavy with meaning. It was a silence that no one dared to break because they knew something sacred was unfolding before their eyes. Sandra sat still, her tears drying slowly, her chest rising and falling in calmer rhythm. She felt lighter, though she couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because she had finally spoken, or maybe it was because someone like Keanu had chosen to stay in her truth instead of looking away. The others sat frozen, their eyes flicking between the two of them. They had entered the room earlier with their own hidden burdens, their own thoughts of daily life pressing against them, but now each of them felt their inner world shifting. Sandra's story had opened a door, and Keanu's silence had pushed it wider. Then, without warning, Keanu leaned forward. His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it, a quiet tremor that made every syllable land heavy in the chest. "There is something I've never spoken about in rooms like this," he said. "I keep it hidden because once words are spoken, they cannot be taken back. But tonight feels different. Tonight feels like maybe silence is no longer enough." The room held its breath. No one moved. No one blinked. Keanu lowered his gaze, his fingers lacing together as though bracing himself. Then he looked up again, and his eyes glistened. "I know what it is to lose people you love, to watch them leave the world too soon, and to live with the empty chair, the echo of their laughter you'll never hear again.
I've carried that loss in silence for years, and every day I walk with it. Some days it feels lighter, some days it crushes me, but I learned that grief is not something you get over, it's something you carry, like a shadow. A ripple of emotion moved through the room. Sandra's lips parted, her eyes shimmering again. Keanu's voice grew softer, almost breaking. I have known loneliness so deep that it made crowded rooms feel like deserts. I have sat on benches, in parks, on buses, surrounded by people, yet feeling invisible. I know the pain of silence because I've lived inside it, and I know the power of kindness because it has saved me more than once. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room, then settling back on Sandra. He said, "You are not weak for speaking your truth tonight. You are strong because you gave us all permission to remember our own. Your courage reminded me that silence can protect us, but it can also isolate us. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to let someone see us as we are, broken, scarred, but still standing." Sandra's hands trembled, but she smiled through her tears. "You gave me that courage," she whispered. Keanu shook his head gently. "No, you gave it to yourself. I only stayed long enough for you to find it." The room filled with quiet sobs, muffled sniffles, people clutching their hands together as if holding themselves together. The raw honesty of what had been shared cut through every defense they had built. And then something unexpected happened. One by one, others began to speak. A man in the corner admitted he hadn't spoken to his brother in 10 years because of pride, and it haunted him daily. A young woman revealed that she had been struggling with self-doubt so strong it had nearly destroyed her dreams. An older woman confessed that she still woke at night reaching for the husband she had lost decades ago. The room transformed into a circle of broken truths, not heavy with shame, but alive with connection. Every voice added a new thread, weaving together a tapestry of human resilience. Sandra listened, her heart swelling. She started with fear, certain her story would make her smaller in their eyes, but instead it had become the spark for something greater. Keanu sat quietly, his gaze soft, his presence steady. He did not interrupt, he did not claim the spotlight, he simply stayed. The same way he had stayed for Sandra, offering the kind of presence that could not be faked. When the voices finally quieted again, Keanu spoke one last time. Life will always bring loss, pain, and silence. But it will also bring moments like this. Moments where strangers become mirrors, where stories remind us that we are not walking alone. The world can be cruel, but it can also be kind. And tonight, kindness has been given and received. Don't forget that. Sandra nodded, her eyes locked with his. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly alive. The others felt it too. The room, once a place of silence and weight, had become something sacred, a space where pain was transformed into connection, and where kindness was no longer just a word, but a living, breathing presence. And as the night ended, everyone knew this truth. Sandra's courage and Keanu's silent gaze had not only shocked them, it had changed them.